Good morning. My name is Ben Farley, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Emory International Law Review. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's symposium, A Worldwide Response, an examination of international law frameworks in the aftermath of natural disasters. Today's symposium is the product of a nearly year-long collaboration between the Emory International Law Review and Emory School of Law's Center for International Comparative Law. It would not have been possible without the help, hard work, and dedication of Mindy Pava, the Executive Symposium Editor of the Emory International Law Review, the guidance and support of Professor Abdul Abnaim, and the logistical support and all the tying of the ends and knots of Edie Bridges, the coordinator for the Center of International Comparative Law. This year, the Emory International Law Review turns 25. For a quarter century, students at Emory University School of Law with a particular interest in international law have edited and contributed to a journal dedicated to advancing international legal scholarship. Over those 25 years, the Emory International Law Review has published articles by distinguished members of our own faculty, the broader scholars of the wider international law community, and notable international figures like Shirin Ebadi, Desmond Tutu, and President Jimmy Carter. And today's symposium, the proceeding of today's symposium will appear in the second issue of the 25th volume of the Emory International Law Review. Before today's program begins, I would like to thank Paul Weisenfeld, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean, for delivering today's keynote address. I would like to thank Jim Chen, Dean of the Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville, Elise Moschini, Senior Humanitarian Delegate to the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, Sophie Smith, Associate Professor of Law at the Beasley School of Law at Temple University, Brian Kincannon Jr., Director of the Institute of Justice and Democracy in Haiti and Coordinator of the Lawyers Earthquake Response Network, Tracy McGaugh, Professor of Law at the Turo Law Center and Director of You, Me, We, and Jonathan Todris, Associate Professor of Law at Georgia State University, for serving as our panelists. I would also like to thank our panel moderators, Professor Polly J. Price, Professor of Law at Emory University, and Professor Laurier Blank, Director of the Emory International Humanitarian Law Clinic. Again, welcome to you all. The Emory International Law Review is tremendously excited to be hosting today's symposium. We hope you'll find the symposium engaging and enlightening. I would now like to invite Mindy Pava, our Executive Symposium Editor, to the podium to introduce the topic of today's symposium.
Good morning. My name is Mindy Pava, and as Ben said, I'm Executive Symposium Editor this year for the Emory International Law Review. I'd like to start with a short story that I heard a few weeks ago on NPR's All Things Considered program. For 18 hours, Romel Joseph lay trapped beneath the rubble. The devastating earthquake that struck Haiti more than 1 year ago left him crushed underneath a school that he had founded. Among other injuries, his left hand was severely damaged. After finally being rescued, Romel recovered in a Miami hospital. While he was recovering, he spoke of returning to Haiti to rebuild the school he had founded. 8 months later, in September 2010, a temporary shelter was erected on the site, and 200 students began their studies again. But while rebuilding the school, Romel also concentrated on healing his hand. Romel, you see, is a violinist who was trained at the Juilliard School of Music. When the earthquake struck, several of the fingers on his violin-playing hand were broken. Now, more than 1 year has passed since the Haiti earthquake, and Romel is playing the violin again, although the pieces are simple. The violinist told NPR's All Things Considered program earlier this month that recovery takes time, but he's grateful to have regained the ability to even play some of these basic musical numbers. Today, we have gathered to discuss how the world can better respond when natural disasters strike. We all saw the catastrophic images of Haiti's destruction last January on television. We similarly watched when the tsunami struck Southeast Asia and when Hurricane Katrina battered our own Gulf Coast. While it is impossible to prevent these acts of nature, what we can control is our ability to respond in a systematic and effective way to help alleviate suffering. Today, I'm looking forward to hearing from our distinguished speakers and panelists. These experts in the field of disaster law and international aid will share their perspective on how the international community has come together in the immediate chaos following a disaster, and also debate potential frameworks for the future. Thank you all for coming and joining us today. As Ben has previously stated, the Emory International Law Review is excited to present a day-long symposium on such a timely topic. As someone who worked as a newspaper reporter for 4 years before coming to law school, I am particularly pleased that this symposium's topic merges practical current events with pertinent academic scholarship. This symposium would not have been possible without the support of Emory's Center for International and Comparative Law. Professor An-Naim has been an invaluable resource to us, and his coordinator for the center, Edie Bridges, was the woman who took care of every single logistical issue involved in planning this process. We specifically wanted to thank Edie, who's standing in the back over there, and we wanted to tell her that now she can spend some time relaxing since this is over. And so on behalf of the Emory Law Review, Edie, we have presented you with a gift card to a restaurant group in Atlanta. We hope you can enjoy it on behalf of us and as a thanks for all of your hard work. I would also like to thank the rest of Emory's faculty and staff for being so supportive of this symposium, including the marketing staff and the technology staff who have been greatly helpful with this event. I'm so grateful to be a part of the Emory International Law Review. This journal promotes academic scholarship, but also provides a caring and family environment. I've enjoyed getting to know all of our second-year students who have helped with the volunteer aspects of coordinating this event. They've done an amazing job, and I know they will provide strong leadership for the EILR in the future. I would also like to thank Jenny Hernandez, sitting in the center. She's been the symposium editor and also a great resource and a great help. I also want to thank the 8 other executive board members on Journal. It's been a privilege to serve on board with you this year. And of course, I can't forget about our editor-in-chief, Ben Farley, who has been a constant source of guidance in planning this symposium. He's been a perfect leader for our journal this year. As Romel continues to recover from his injuries in Haiti, he hopes to one day again play the type of music that he learned at Juilliard. Similarly, I hope that countries such as Haiti affected by natural disasters can also recover from their significant wounds. I truly hope that some of the ideas expressed at today's symposium can provide a blueprint for how the international community can provide a more cohesive and rapid response to devastated countries in the future. Before introducing Professor An-Naim, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, Paul Weisenfeld, I want to turn the podium over to the Dean of Emory Law School, David Partlet, who has a few opening remarks for you all. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Mindy. Beautifully said. I just want to step down from upstairs. This is completely unexpected, and there's a sort of row of thank yous that the audience has to put up with. But I wanted to just take a moment to thank the students on the International Journal, the board of the journal. This is it's a lot of very hard work that goes into organising a symposium of this kind. We've had, in my time, just outstanding groups of students who have done this. And again, the standard has been kept up this year, and what a timely topic. There is no doubt about it. And congratulations on assembling such a distinguished panel of experts on this. Particularly my colleague in the decanal ranks, Jim Chen, who is coming back to his alma mater, as a matter of fact. I've got to remind him all the time that he's an old Emory guy. So the only mistake that Mindy made was, of course, that Edie Bridges will not have any downtime after this. She's always got to work very hard. She's kept at it all of the time on the grindstone. It strikes me, thinking about this topic, that I've just come back from Australia, where of course in Queensland there was tremendous flood devastation. The floods there extended to the size of France, the area under flood. And it's said in Australia that the impact of those floods will be greater in its relative economic impact than Katrina was in the United States. Now, it's interesting that as you look at these natural disasters, you see that some nations in the world are capable of responding in a way that keeps these disasters controllable. You get compensation to persons, there's economic dislocation, and yet there's a progress forward. And it says something, I guess, about the inequalities in this world when those countries that suffer tremendous devastation and haven't got the wherewithal to do what is necessary to get that society back, to get compensation to persons, to revive lives, are those that present so many tragic stories, very much the story that Mindy was telling us just a moment ago. So this is a wonderful topic. Congratulations to the board. My thanks to the participants, the panelists who have come here today. I know that it's going to be a wonderful day of real academic stimulation and a real-world examination of what international law, international community can do to respond to these devastating events in our world today. Thank you.
Good morning, and I will keep it very brief because, as the imparter said, you might think that we never get to the real stuff. I'm Abdou Al-Naim. I teach here at Emory Law School, and I'm the director of the International Comparative Law Center. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of remarks. One is, to start with, is our partnership with Emory Law students has been tremendous. I mean, this is the second time we work in partnership with the Law Review Board to launch a symposium, and we hope, with the Dean's support, is he still around, that we continue to be able to continue this partnership in the future. It has always been exciting and really gratifying to see students coming to their own and really taking leadership and initiative and delivering on the promise of their ideas. And I was particularly excited with the idea that Mindy and Ben presented in terms of this symposium's focus on natural disasters and real-world response, because it coincides with a personal conviction that we owe for our privilege of education, of resources, that we pay back. As the imparted have said, that those who are less fortunate, all of us, of course, suffer on what we call our shared human vulnerability to disasters and to disease and to all sorts of negative experiences. The question is how we respond. That is what we control. And I think as President Obama actually said recently, there are things beyond our control, but there are things within our control. It's only by doing what we can on things within our control that we really stand up and honor our humanity and the humanity of all people we work with. The focus, I think, the very nice blending of scholarship and experience that all the speakers bring to our symposium today is also very inspiring. And in presenting Paul Weisenfeld as a speaker, I think you have his CV on the back of your program, so I will not read that, but just to highlight the tremendous field experience that he has had from Peru to Zimbabwe to Egypt and most recently on Haiti last year. And to know that, of course, he's originally a Harvard lawyer who practiced law in New York. So it is possible to go on and do great things despite or maybe because of your legal training and practical experience. I hope this will inspire all of us in this room that there is a lot we can do as lawyers, as Emory lawyers in particular in our case, and the world awaits our promise and our delivery on our promise. I would be delighted and honored now to welcome Paul to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I guess I'll continue the tradition of thanking people. But let me do it with a little story. When I was a 1L in law school, I guess is this going to buzz if I leave it close to the... When I was a 1L in law school, I participated on the Human Rights Law Journal. And we put together a symposium on apartheid in South Africa. Those were the days, of course, when apartheid was the big issue on student campuses. So I do know how difficult and how much hard work it takes to put together a symposium, and it takes a lot of dedication. So congratulations to the students at Emory Law School and to the International Law Review. Thank you very much for the opportunity and for the hard work and dedication on an issue that's really very topical. As your dean said, kind of the issues about disasters are really issues about poverty. We can't prevent disasters, but the impact and the extent of the impact, the magnitude, really has a lot to do with the poverty of the countries, the ability of the country to respond, and the extent of the devastation and death you'll see has more to do with the poverty and the institutional capacities of the country than anything else. So I'm going to talk exclusively about Haiti. I know our other panelists are going to talk more broadly about disasters and disaster law, but my focus will be on Haiti, mostly on an operational perspective, because my current job is really an operational job. It's not a legal job. But I'll touch a little bit on some legal issues. And again, I'm going to focus on USAID's role, because that's what I'm most familiar with. After talking, I'm going to start talking about the disaster itself, Haiti pre-earthquake, what the impact of the earthquake was. I'll do a little bit on the international response and USAID's role in the response. Then I'll talk about USAID's mandate, and that's where I'll get into a couple of legal issues, our mandate and issues about coordination within the USG as we think about improving the effectiveness of an overall response. I'll do a little bit about lessons learned, and then some of the key challenges that we face going forward, such as land title, IDPs, internally displaced peoples, and the relief to reconstruction continuum challenge, which we always face in disasters, and kind of end with issues of sovereignty. So pre-earthquake context in Haiti. I think people are probably familiar, if folks have read the newspapers about Haiti. You know that Haiti was the poorest country in the hemisphere for a long time. It's ranked 148 out of 179 on the UN's Human Development Index. It's 80% of the population is unemployed or severely underemployed. 1 in 4 children are malnourished in Haiti. And one of the statistics that says a lot about the status of the country is 12% of Haitians have access to electricity. The next lowest number in the hemisphere is 60% in Honduras, in Guatemala. So it's a country with deep development challenges that existed at 9 o'clock in the morning on January 12th, before the earthquake. Now, having an earthquake of the magnitude that it did on top of those challenges is a tragedy on top of a tragedy, of course. The earthquake gave us a lot of firsts in the world, and firsts in a negative sense. It is the largest urban displacement that the international community has ever seen. In response, we had the largest distribution of emergency shelters that we've ever organized as an international community. The earthquake resulted in the destruction of 28 out of 29 ministries and killed an extraordinarily large number of civil servants. Data is always difficult to find in these situations, and people are not really sure. I hear numbers all over the place as to how many civil servants died. I've heard up to 20. I've heard as low as 11%. Even if you take the 11% figure, that's extraordinary. It's hard to imagine a disaster in the United States that would have destroyed most of the buildings of the federal government and 10 or more % of the civil service, and then to think about how we could organize a response in an effective way. Ports and airports were crippled. It's because of the earthquake occurred in Port-au-Prince, so that dramatically affected the ability to respond and get supplies and people in. The response was, because of the magnitude, what we're calling a whole-of-government response. President Obama ordered an aggressive response that called on the full capacities of the U.S. government and put USAID as the lead federal agency. That was new for us. I mean, we're in the business of humanitarian response and also long-term development programs. There are really two sides of our business. Our humanitarian response guys tend not to talk much to the long-term development sides, but this This disaster brought us together within the agency, but it also brought us together in the government because we had not confronted a disaster of this size. So we had to draw on capacities outside of our agency, and us leading other agencies that are significantly larger than us, such as the Department of Defense, was a challenge. And to tell a little story about that, General Keane is the 3-star general in Southcom, the Southern Combatant Command. And Haiti falls within the scope of Southcom. So Southcom sent in a large number of troops. They sent in 22,000 at its height. We had an existing mission in Haiti of maybe 25 Americans and 100 or so Haitians who work for us doing long-term development programs. So General Keane was told USAID is in charge. He went over to the USAID office and he told me, so I looked around and I said, well, where's your 300-person command center like I have? So it's extraordinarily challenging to have a mission of a couple of hundred people leading 22,000 troops with a 300-person command center. So now we're obviously just past the 1-year mark. So there's a lot of ink being spilt and on taking stock of what happened. As you read the press and listen to NPR, my view is the debate that is really going on is the glass half full, is the glass half empty, about where are we in Haiti 1 year later. I guess I would say two things about that. One is it's not a surprise that in the poorest country in the hemisphere that is hit by the biggest natural disaster in the history of the hemisphere, that a year later it's easy to find lots of things that justify an analysis that the glass is half empty. There's obviously an enormous amount of work to do, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. At the same time, as development of professionals, and if our job is to move forward, to be optimistic, to look for the successes that we can build on, but also obviously be realistic about the challenges. So thinking about the successes, I want to talk a little bit about what they were. In the sense of some of the first Haiti brought us, one of the positives is it was the largest search and rescue operation ever manned in history. Led by the United States mostly, but there were lots of other nations involved in it. The Spanish, the French, the Canadians, the Italians all sent teams down, but there were major teams that were from USAID sent teams, the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency under our authority sent teams down and manned the largest search and rescue operation ever. It was the largest urban feeding program that was ever launched. And all of this in a situation where the ports and airports are crippled, the capital is brought to its knees, and the international community was able to step up and feed 4 million people in a very short period of time is an extraordinary accomplishment. Between the military sent a hospital ship offshore, and we sent in several medical teams from the Department of Health and Human Services. They operated on they saw and treated 30,000 patients and performed about 400 surgeries in a very short period of time. Obviously, airport and port operations were restored, mostly by our colleagues in the Department of Defense. And, excuse me. And the Department of Defense also helped us with airlift capacity to reach hard-to-reach remote areas with food and medicine. Kind of some of the bigger successes we talk about is if you think about the context of 1 million people displaced, or more than 1 million, it was 1.5 million at one point, the 1.3 million number stuck for many months. The biggest fears were, first, widespread disease. That if you have that unknown number of people displaced, not unknown, but unprecedented number of people displaced in an urban setting, in a country where the water systems are poor and access to health is poor, the fear was a second disaster, a second tragedy with widespread disease. So the first couple of months when I was in Peru when the earthquake happened, and about 3 days afterwards I was called back to Washington to be the coordinator of our Washington-based task force that oversaw this. And I did that for 9 months before moving to my current position, which is in charge of the career person in charge of Latin America. So we were very fearful about widespread disease. So the biggest focus for several months was just on health issues. And so we vaccinated 1 million people within a few months' time. And I say we, I mean the international community. This wasn't just USAID. It was a range and network of NGOs and international organizations and other donors. But that was the largest vaccination campaign in that short period of time. Distributed 800,000 mosquito nets, and that was a hugely successful effort. There was no outbreak of waterborne diseases in Port-au-Prince. Cholera, which is a big issue that's confronting Haiti right now, started in the center of the country away from the camp. So the effort to prevent waterborne diseases there was successful. The second biggest fear is we knew that the hurricanes were going to come, and no one has ever experienced 1 million more plus displaced people when you're worrying about hurricanes coming through. And we all knew that the plastic sheeting that was given out, which is all that could physically be done in a short period of time, was not going to be sufficient to protect people from the elements. So there was an enormous international effort to clean drainage canals, because I guess we were a little bit lucky, because Port-au-Prince, people do not die in hurricanes in Port-au-Prince typically from the wind. They die from flooding. Thank you very much. They die from flooding. It's Port-au-Prince, fortunately, is sheltered from high winds. But the flooding happens, and this is another example of why poverty and institutional capacity are so critical here. The flooding happens because there's no solid waste disposal system in Port-au-Prince. Here we have the benefit of someone picking up your trash. In Port-au-Prince, it's thrown in the canals. So the canals are filled for feet high with garbage over decades and decades. And the rains come through and they flood and people die. And every year, hundreds and hundreds of people die. 2008, they had several tropical storms in a 2-week period and over 1,000 people died. So everyone obviously was fearful of what's the impact of that going to be when you have more than 1 million people living in the streets. So there was a major effort. There was probably $30 to $40 million spent to clean out 9 kilometers of canals. We did a lot of it by providing cash to individual Haitians who did manual labor, because you recover from a disaster when you have money in your pocket. So doing this through what we call cash for work programs was, I think, an effective way to get cash in people's pockets, allow them to buy things, but clean out the canals. So clearing canals, digging drainage ditches around the camp, stabilizing slopes, sandbags. So when Hurricane Tomas passed through, there were 21 deaths, and 21 deaths is in and of itself a tragedy, but compared to 1,000 in 2008 when there weren't displaced people, I think is another one of the major achievements. Shelters. So the biggest concern in Haiti continues to be obviously the number of displaced people, the primary concern. The numbers have come down recently. They were, I said, 1.3 million for a number of months, and the International Organization for Migration, which has been doing the tracking of families and registering of displaced peoples, reports 810,000 people as of a few weeks ago. And that, one of the things we struggle with at an operational side is the CNN effect. It's very easy to go down to Haiti, and at ground level visual, you see miles and miles of displaced people and living in horrible conditions, and it looks terrible. If you think about any other normal disaster, if the international community had resettled 500,000 people in a year, it would be viewed as an extraordinary achievement, because we've never done a resettlement of 500,000 people in a year. In Haiti, because the numbers of displaced are so tremendous, you can't even see that at a ground level visual with a CNN camera. So, but there is progress being made on resettling, a long way to go. And I can, if in the question and answer period, I can talk a little bit more about the strategy to resettle people in the housing strategy if there's interest. So turning to USAID's mandate for a minute. We're a federal agency. We're authorized by federal legislation, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, obviously pushed by President Kennedy. The Foreign Assistance Act gives us very broad legal authority to respond in disasters, particularly our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which focuses on that. The Act does provide that notwithstanding any other provision of law, the President and the authorities delegated down to the head of our OFDA office. The President is authorized to furnish assistance to any foreign country, international organization, or private voluntary organization on such terms and conditions as he may determine for international disaster relief and rehabilitation, including assistance related to disaster preparedness, the prediction and/or contingency planning for natural disasters. I know I read that quickly, but if you look at authorities that the U.S. government has to program, there's almost no authority we have that's as broad as that. That basically says we can do anything we want with whoever we want, notwithstanding any other provision of law. And the government has lots and lots of controls over what we do. So disaster for us, is really cordoned off, and we have broad authority to make decisions. Now, there are oversight systems. We get inspected, and I have to testify next week at the House Oversight Committee that's interested in what we're doing. But to start with, we're not shackled by laws. So that broad authority is hugely helpful for us. Practically, we use the authority to do grants and cooperative agreements to non-governmental organizations like the IFRC, to public international organizations like the Pan American Health Organization. We don't implement programs directly. We work through partners. The difference in Haiti, kind of what came up in Haiti, is we worked a lot through other agencies. But other federal agencies don't have authority to work overseas. Health and Human Services, which we paid for sending several of their medical teams down, they don't have legal authority or funding to do work overseas. So we can sign interagency agreements with them, but interagency agreements are normally a cumbersome process. It's something that will typically take months, but in Haiti, we were in a situation where we needed to move right away. So we put a team of lawyers working on this and tried to cut interagency agreements within a period. We got it down, I think, to 2 hours. But they can't, again, it's a question of legal authority, fiscal authority. They don't have the legal authorities to do work overseas. So that was a big issue that we had to deal with at the time. Okay, in terms of, I'm going to switch a little bit to lessons learned, focusing a lot on how we make our own response more effective, not necessarily lessons learned yet on Haiti. So this was a whole-of-government approach. We had multiple agencies involved and the big, heavy presence of the Department of Defense. We actually commissioned a study from an independent consulting group to look at the first 6 months and tell us what did we do well, what did we do wrong, how can we improve our effectiveness for these catastrophic disasters. Because we've had, I think Mindy mentioned, we've had the tsunami in Indonesia, floods in Pakistan. Katrina is the concern of FEMA, not our concern, and the earthquake in Haiti. I don't want to say it's clear, but I think it's a good bet that we're going to have to deal with major international catastrophes. So we need to think about how we can improve our response in these things and not do it on an ad hoc basis. I guess the principal lesson we learned is that we're very well set up when you have, last year people didn't even notice, Hurricane Tomas, everyone focused on it passing by Haiti. It passed by St. Lucia and caused pretty extraordinary damage in St. Lucia. I think there were more than 100 people killed. There was flooding for a similar hurricane in Mexico that killed a couple of hundred people. We're very well equipped to handle those types of disasters. We have disaster assistance response teams. We can send them out in 24 hours. We have mechanisms to respond. That's easy. When you get to tsunami, Pakistan floods, Haiti earthquake, we don't have a system set up to surge staff to do that. So we basically don't have the capacity on hand to respond to major catastrophes on an international basis. It's all been ad hoc. We've cobbled it together. We have to cobble together how we do interagency agreements to draw on the capacities of other agencies. One of the findings of the study is going to be published in a week or two, but one of the findings of it is that we need to kind of clarify or bridge the divide between the diplomatic response and the humanitarian response. A lot of this has to do with internal relations within the U.S. government. USAID is technically an independent agency, but the head of our agency the administrator reports to the Secretary of State. So we're under the policy guidance of the Secretary of State. And you get, lines can get crossed very easily because in any response, there's a diplomatic part of the response, and there's the development and the humanitarian part of the response. And the independent consultants we hired said that there was a lot of confusion there, and we need to clarify just between our two agencies principally who has what role, because we do need to approach the government. We approach the government a lot because on the USAID side, because we have lots of equities in dealing with them, and the Department of State and the ambassador do a lot. And we need to do a better job of thinking through roles and functions, delineating roles and functions. Another one of their findings has to do with, for a major disaster like Haiti, the level of attention, part of it is the CNN effect, part of it is the proximity of Haiti to the United States. It immediately got attention from the White House. The White House really did not pay attention to the damage Hurricane Tomas did in St. Lucia, notwithstanding the fact that it was worse than in Haiti. Haiti gets a lot of attention, and there will be major disasters that get a lot of attention. So how do we structure the Washington, one of the issues they looked at, how do we structure Washington coordination systems to, the phrase we use in Washington is to feed the beast, to give the information to senior policymakers that they need so that we can get focused, clear guidance and move forward on an operational basis. And they're recommending that the National Security Council set up an interagency coordinating committee that we can stand up quickly when there's a major disaster. But the fundamental recommendation of our consultants is create what they're calling an international response framework. FEMA, following Katrina, set up a national response framework. And I have to be honest, not familiar with FEMA because I spend my whole career working on overseas issues. But they struggle with the same issue. If you have a major disaster like Katrina, how do you stand up surge capacity and set in place systems to coordinate? So the consultant said we need to replicate that on the international side. So create an international response framework that sets out pre-agreed on protocols and agreements. So if we need FEMA or HHS or DOD or any other agency, we've got agreements that we've agreed to in advance and we can just activate them. But also lay out systems of roles and responsibilities, who's in charge, who reports to whom, who does what reporting. Because we found that a lot of attention and staff resources, time and staff resources, were diverted to figuring this out rather than responding to the crisis. We wasted a lot of time looking at those kinds of issues. So we need to clarify those roles and responsibilities and set systems in place to surge our capacities with other agencies. Issue of civil-military, or what you call in Washington, civ-mil cooperation, is a big issue. A lot of donor NGOs are not used to working with the U.S. military. And a lot of NGOs, frankly, don't like working with the U.S. military. They think that the military role needs to stay separate. If you go back to kind of the history of our founding legislation, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1991, it was really set up in a lot of ways to clarify that foreign assistance is not going to be mixed up with, to separate military and non-military aid, because there is a whole system of military assistance, foreign military financing. We have a number of tools that the military uses. So from '61 until recently, the government's approach has been very clear about separating military and non-military assistance. But we know with a major disaster, it's kind of like a phrase I've heard from a movie, it's really good to have those guys around if you have a major disaster. Because to be honest, there's no other institution on the planet that has the logistical capabilities of the U.S. military. If the airports, as international donors, we're dependent on commercial transport, whether it's sea or air. If the airports and the ports are crushed, we're dead in the water. The only institutions that can respond are military institutions, and the capacity of the U.S. Department of Defense far exceeds any other institution, military or civilian. So we have to realize that in a major catastrophe, the Department of Defense is going to be involved. And for many years in USAID, we've tried to keep a distance from the Department of Defense, and we need to really think carefully about civ-military cooperation, what the roles are. In the Haiti experience, they were very clear. They say, we were told you guys are in charge. So they salute to us, tell us what to do. It's hard with our couple of people to tell these 20,000 guys what to do, but we have to be prepared in complex situations to bring the military in, to think very clearly about what they're doing, and most importantly, and this is highlighted in the report that's going to come out in a week or two, think clearly about when they're going to leave. There was a huge debate in Washington because of the concept, it's really good to have those guys around. They can get a lot done. They can get a lot done quickly because we can tell them, go build 10,000 trenches, and they can send a whole bunch of people and do it. But the lines blur quickly, and their job is usually to find and kill people that we've decided are bad people. So it's important to think about what are the end states for the military. When is the situation okay to get them out? And think about that before they go in. So that's another key finding. Last key lesson learned I want to talk about is about monitoring and evaluation. We were talking a little bit about this last night. I'm a lawyer, I guess, I don't know if everyone here is a lawyer, but I assume most people are. And I know most lawyers say, I didn't go to law school to learn math or to do math. But if you start to work in development, statistics, data, analysis, math, monitoring and evaluation is key, and every year more important. In the Haiti experience, there were lots and lots of organizations that went in. Various international donors, international NGOs, local NGOs, the US military, everyone's reporting, everyone's measuring, there's data flying all over the place. It was a total confusion. It's kind of, you're lost in the volume of data and reporting. And largely there was a lot of time wasted doing that. So a big finding of this report is we need to think carefully about data collection, monitoring progress, because it's absolutely key. If you don't look at data, you can't identify gaps. And if you're feeding 4 million people, but there are 20,000 people in some remote location who are starving, you've basically failed. So it's a key question, how do you set up and coordinate systems when you have a myriad of actors that don't waste everyone's time reporting duplicative or useless information, but very quickly identify gaps and give you the data that you want? And we're a long way from doing that as an international community. There's the UN cluster system, which if you're really interested in coordination of disasters, you have to get into questions of the UN cluster system, is a significant advance over what existed in the response to the tsunami, but there's still a long way to go. And part of the reason is there are a lot of private actors out there. There's the goodwill of the American people alone is extraordinary. The figure's 1/2 of all American families donated to Haiti earthquake relief. They gave it to the American Red Cross, the International Federation of the Red Cross, World Vision, CARE, Catholic Relief Services. In a small earthquake or a normal or small natural disaster, most of the NGOs will get the vast, vast majority of their funding from major donors. If it's in this hemisphere, they'll get the vast majority of their funding from us. So it's very easy then for us to put in place and require reporting systems so that everyone can send in standard reports. We can get data that's easy to understand and identify gaps and know where to target resources. In Haiti, that was a completely different story because you have all of these people operating with their own money who don't feel an obligation to report to anyone, and they're out there doing God's work in some remote village. And in fact, they are out there doing God's work in some remote village. But we really need to know what they're doing and what the problems are, and are they missing certain pieces of equipment that are essential. So improving that whole coordination system, data collection and analysis is critical, and the UN has to take a big lead in that. So I'm going to move to some key challenges now. A key challenge in Haiti is the question of land tenure. There's questions of land around rubble. And we could talk about, I won't talk about rubble now, but if people are interested, we can talk in the question and answer period, because rubble has occupied several months of my life in the last year. But land tenure is a very difficult issue. In an early meeting we had with President Preval, I raised the question, because no one was talking about land tenure. No one has title, no one seems to know who has real ownership of what property. If 70% of the population in Port-au-Prince are renters, which has its own challenges for resettlement. Because how do you resettle people? Or if you repair a house, let me back up a little bit. If you think about the way the market works, with the large amount of housing stock that was destroyed, obviously the price of the remaining houses went up. So the rents have gone through the roof because of just that factor, the destruction of houses, but also because you now have an enormous number of international people moving in. The UN, agencies, the USAID, other donors, taking all the good houses for their staff, so prices have gone up. If we then go in and fix housing stock in a situation where most people are renters, how do you control and prevent the owner of the house from then renting to someone who's not displaced, but charging a higher rent to someone else? So it's a very difficult situation to work in. So 70% renters, very few people with land. You also have a situation in Haiti, which I haven't seen elsewhere, where it's common to have the land owned by one person, the house owned by another person, and then it's rented to a third person. And to move in and try to resettle people in that complex situation is a nightmare. So going back, I raised this issue in a meeting with President Preval, or maybe February or March, and he said, we can't fix the land system. I was like shocked by that. Sorry, not that we can't fix it ever, but we can't fix it and think about fixing it as a requirement to resettling people. And in hindsight, not hindsight, I learned pretty quickly that he was right. I was new in February. I was new to working on Haiti. I've worked most of my career in Africa, one tour in Peru, one tour in Egypt. But the story he told us was they launched years ago a system to try and clarify land claims in the Artibonite, in the center of the country. And the claims that came in that one department of the country exceeded the entire land mass of Haiti. And they just decided, we really can't work this out right now. So we brought in international land experts from the University of Wisconsin. We have a couple of international land experts on our staff, and we sent them down for 3 weeks, and they came back and said exactly what Praval said. They said, if you guys try to fix the land tenure system, these people are going to be in these tent camps for 10 years. So what we've moved towards is community-based enumeration, which is basically you hold community meetings and ask the community to agree who has the right of occupancy over what plot. And if the community agrees that this family lived here and everyone's going to accept their right to live there, that's good enough for us and we're going to move on because we're not going to fix the land tenure system in Haiti. Now, we're combining that with, we're doing this through the International Organization for Migration principally and through a range of donors. We're combining that with the enumeration part is recording these rights of occupancy so that hopefully one day that information will be useful is for someone who wants to take on the larger challenge. Because we do know, if you read the work of Hernando de Soto, that you're not going to make long-term sustainable progress unless you clarify land ownership rights. So it is a key issue, but we can't let that hold us back in responding to immediate humanitarian needs. Kind of next big challenge is the whole IDP challenge, resettlement of the IDPs. I said I'd wait to questions if people wanted to talk about housing and rubble issues. But the IDP issue itself is a difficult issue. IDPs are people who, they're displaced, but they haven't crossed an international boundary. That, in and of itself, creates a lot of complexities. People are displaced often obviously for natural disaster. In many countries, it's for armed conflict. In some countries, they're displaced because of the actions of their own government. But because they haven't crossed an international boundary, they are still under the laws and authority and protection of their own government. Amnesty International estimates that there are twice as many IDPs worldwide, over 24 million, as there are international refugees, 14 million. So it's a big issue for us as to how you deal with it. In the UN, we follow the UN guidelines. The UN has guiding principles on internal displacement. It's not an international covenant. People haven't signed up to it. It's not a binding obligation. But our approach at USAID is we follow them and we encourage countries to follow them. I'll go through what they are. They raise challenges principally because in major disasters where countries are suffering or the impact of the disaster is extraordinary, principally because the country is weak, has weak institutional capacity and poverty, it's hard to apply these when the country doesn't have the capacity to apply them. And then it's even worse in countries where they don't have the political will to apply them. But in Haiti, fortunately, it's a capacity issue. So we had 1.5 million people displaced, down to 810,000. Now, the first UN principle is equal rights, that people who are displaced should have the same rights as everyone else. In many countries, that's not the case in terms of international domestic law. The second principle is primary responsibility, that national authorities have the primary duty for protection and humanitarian assistance to IDPs. Easy to say in Haiti, but hard to apply. Protection rights themselves are the third principle applying to IDPs. The right to request and receive protection and humanitarian assistance. You find all over the world people who are displaced are vulnerable. In Haiti, if you follow the news closely, lots of stories about gender-based violence. As people are displaced from their communities, community structure, systems of protection that constrain bad behavior break down. So people are vulnerable, and the right of protection is one of these important principles. Non-discrimination is another one of the UN guiding principles. People shouldn't be discriminated against simply because they are displaced. There are other principles that deal more specifically with vulnerable populations and protection against violence, but those are similar to what I talked about. But the last one that I'll mention that's key in Haiti as well is freedom of movement. In a lot of countries you see displaced peoples that the government says, okay, we don't want you moving to this nice piece of land, you have to move here. But the UN guiding principles are freedom of movement and right to choose where you live. That, again, is something hard to apply. And legal documentation. That was a big issue in Haiti. A lot of people lost, fortunately not as many as was feared, but a lot of people lost their ID cards. And this was an enormous challenge as Haiti went through the presidential election. But the UN guiding principles talk about a right to legal documentation, the obligation of the government to provide people with documentation so that they can exercise their rights. Finally, there's a guiding principle on education, that the right for displaced children to receive education. The UN principle says which should be free and compulsory. Education is not free and compulsory in Haiti now, so it's hard to apply that to IDPs. So what are we doing on the UN guiding principles? We take them as our guide. Obviously, our response of food, shelter, water, health services is focused to a large extent on displaced populations. There is a challenge that you have to think about avoiding a pull effect, because as much as living in the tent camps is an undignified lifestyle, it's not much below some of the neighboring communities. And there are people who will choose to move to those camps because, for a couple of factors. One is you don't pay rent, and that's a huge benefit. To go someplace, not pay rent, get free health services and free everything else for a while. So you have to try and balance it and think about the pull factor. The decision is therefore we don't decide not to provide services to IDPs, but we have to think more broadly and provide them to communities and everyone at risk. Safety issues, to think about protection from violence. So there has been a large effort that we've supported in a big way to provide training to the Haitian National Police, to build facilities in the camps for the Haitian National Police, little police stations, to provide lighting, to make sure that latrines and showers for men and women are appropriately spaced, make sure the camp is lit, but the latrines and showers are not lit. So that's a fundamental part of complying with that principle. Information is another big issue. You find and that's a huge challenge. IDPs, I didn't mention this principle, but they have a right to know what their disposition is going to be, what's going to happen to us. And in any situation, that uncertainty is really, it takes its psychological toll. So we've supported the government of Haiti's communications ministry in radio programs and getting messages out to IDPs. And we've supported clearing of, as I think it was Mindy who mentioned, we've supported building temporary schools and clearing rubble in and around the camps. Legal services as well. So through an agreement with the local bar association, we're providing legal services to IDPs in the major camps. Okay, I'm going to move next to the Relief to Reconstruction Continuum. And the development literature talks a lot about the importance of making sure that you have this Relief to Reconstruction Continuum. It's easy to say, I think it's easy to understand the principle that you want to provide relief in a way that feeds into long-term reconstruction, that supports it. It's hard to do in a lot of cases. Ideally, you want to program humanitarian relief sources such that it kind of seamlessly moves into long-term reconstruction and helps build it up. Our broad authority under relief, as I said, allows us to do pretty much anything. For development purposes, if you go through the Foreign Assistance Act, it's a completely different story. It requires very detailed programming and planning that has long time frames. We can give out humanitarian grants very quickly. We cannot program, if we comply with our laws, we can't program development or reconstruction resources quickly because we're required to do a series of detailed plans. For instance, for building houses or temporary shelters or, permanent shelters. For displaced people, there's a range of engineering studies we have to do, and it's sensible. You know, Haiti's a place that's vulnerable to natural disasters. So we've had multiple situations where the government has offered land and said you can put people in this land. We send out engineers, and the engineers say, if you put people there, they're all going to be flooded away the next rainy season. So it's sensible. You have to do those kinds of studies before you invest long-term development dollars. But that in and of itself makes the marriage, the continuum, a difficult thing to do. Long-term reconstruction systems, programs, are also subject to U.S. government open procurement regulations, which by their nature take a long time. Humanitarian assistance, because of our broad authorities, we don't have to do open competitive procurement processes. So A couple of specific areas where this has been a challenge. First, I already mentioned, is housing. So the initial goal was we're going to put up temporary housing structures, and why don't we put them up where we're going to build permanent housing structures? Sounds great. That was the idea. We really have not, I don't want to say we've completely failed at that, but we were not able to do the engineering studies to to determine that land was appropriate for permanent housing quickly enough to respond to the urgent humanitarian need to get people in some sort of temporary shelter as the hurricane was approaching. So that's something that is not, the transition was not done as quickly as we would have liked. Another reason that the housing issue became difficult to think about this transition is immediately after the earthquake, most of the engineers, and me being a non-engineer as well, thought, just from my first couple of visits to the country, this is a big demolition job. You just need to knock down half of the city and reconstruct it. So everyone told us, okay, well, if you're going to knock stuff down, you got to bring in engineers to tell you exactly how you knock particular buildings down. So we hired an engineering firm out of San Francisco that specializes in this kind of work. And within a couple of weeks, they came back and told us, you know, most of this housing stock is actually fine. And we were shocked, because it doesn't look like that to the untrained lawyer. We're not good at math and we're not good at engineering. So we launched a program to do assessments of the houses, and the World Bank joined us, and several other donors. The UK, DFID, Department for International Development, joined us. To date, we've done 380,000 structures, and 54% of them are fine. And that's been a big shock. It took we only finished the 380,000 about 2 weeks ago. So the plans for resettling people have had to evolve dramatically as we go along, which again makes that relief to reconstruction continuum very difficult to plan when you realize that the situation on the ground is not what you initially thought it was. It's good news, however, that 54% of the housing stock is fine. So we've created a system with the Ministry of Public Works where they stamp the houses green and people know you can go into this house. It may not look good, but it is structurally sound. It will withstand another earthquake. About 24%, 23, something like that, are stamped yellow, meaning they are not safe for occupancy. They are not structurally sound, but they can be repaired at minimal cost, which we've defined at less than $4,000. But the average cost is coming in at $1,300. It's extraordinary because it's a big savings below building new housing. The balance of the houses, whether they look good or not, and you can't tell from a visual inspection the difference between a yellow and a red house. The red are completely unsafe, but they're being stamped red. And that in and of itself is important because some people were living in these houses anyway, so it's important for them to know that the house is no good. So I think where we've done a good job in the relief to reconstruction continuum is on food. We've got much better systems to think about food distribution. So we ramped up as an international community through the World Food Program, feeding 4 million people. And at the same time, you can send in people to study food prices on the markets. And we know that if food prices start to drop, that means that we're having a negative impact on the market. And it took us, I can't remember if it was 4 weeks or some period of time, we started to see food prices drop. We scaled back from wide-scale food distribution to targeting it on vulnerable populations and putting food through local markets, and scaled up programs for seeds and fertilizers to local farmers. So that's something that kind of the systems are in place to do that. So I'm going to end with talking about sovereignty, and which is a little bit sovereignty and a couple of things on long-term success, and then take some questions. Sovereignty isn't an issue we deal with a lot in international disasters, but we worry about the potential for it. The system that we follow is we won't go in to respond unless we're asked to by a government. And once we're asked, then we say, fine, we don't have to worry about sovereignty, you asked us. In countries where they don't ask us, but there's an overwhelming moral humanitarian imperative to respond, you get kind of wrapped up around the ankles as to what to do. But our standards are, our ambassador has to declare a disaster, and it has to be based on 3 determinations. One, that the magnitude is beyond the country's ability to respond adequately. The second, the country has requested or will accept U.S. assistance. And third, that we've determined that it's in the U.S. interest to respond. So if we meet those standards, we don't worry about it. And again, Haiti, fortunately, we didn't have to worry about this. But there are cases where we do. What you're confronted with here often is, in a case like Haiti, and in many cases, we have to send in lots and lots of commodities. Most countries, Haiti is a country where they get most of their income from the government through the customs house. So they tax things as they come in. You can't respond to a disaster if you're trying to clear customs and deal with taxes. So there are lots of issues that our lawyers worry about and work through in negotiating duty-free rapid entry of goods and commodities. So that's the biggest issue we deal with in terms of dealing with host country laws and commodities. Okay, so long-term, we're obviously moving towards a long-term development program focused in agriculture, for us, infrastructure, which is both housing and electricity, healthcare, and looking at governance issues. Our deputy administrator has said to me, well, people haven't fixed Haiti with billions of dollars in the 10 years before the earthquake. How are we going to fix it now? So the real answer to that is we're not going to fix it. We can't fix it. We can never fix it. It's only the Haitians who can fix Haiti. If you read development literature, to have long-term, let me put it a different way. We can improve. I think we responded extraordinarily effectively to the largest disaster in the hemisphere. We can improve our response and be more effective and continue to save lives when there are disasters. But if we're only saving lives and responding to disasters, we're not getting anywhere. We have to get at the underlying issues of poverty and institutional capacity weaknesses, institutional weaknesses that are causing these disasters in Haiti to have such a tremendous impact. Now, how do we get there? I think, if you think about it, there's a phrase that Home Depot used for a while, you can do it, we can help. And that's the mindset, because we can only help. We can't make the hard decisions for them. And the development literature is pretty clear that if you're going to have long-term sustainable success, the country has to have what we would call in Washington, you have to have a government that has skin in the game. They have to be committed to make the hard policy decisions. And there are hard policy decisions the Haitians have to make to move forward. They have to clean up the customs house, for instance. There are a lot of people who are getting money out of the inefficient operations of the customs house. The electricity sector. There are reasons why the electricity sector doesn't move forward. They have to make those hard decisions. We can give them the advice, but they've got to make the decisions. Second, you have to have strong institutions that can implement those decisions. And we can, again, provide lots of training and technical assistance along with other donors, but that's fundamentally a Haitian responsibility. And third, you have to have markets that really function pretty well and allocate resources. And by any measure, Haiti was pretty low on, again, at 9 o'clock in the morning on January 12, 2010. On all those three criteria, they didn't perform well, and they're worse now. So the challenge is significant. Nonetheless, there's a lot of work that's been done. I went through the successes, and I think there are things that we can build on in the coming year. So we hope this year is going to be a good year for progress in Haiti. If we can resettle another 500,000 people or 800,000 people, that will be a significant accomplishment. We, again, as the international community, not USAID, but it's going to be a long-term challenge. We're talking about looking at a 10, 15-year time horizon to really rebuild from a disaster of this magnitude. So I'm not sure how long I went. I forgot to take off my watch, and time is up. 35? 45. Wow, okay. So is there no times for questions? I didn't hear you. I can say? Okay.
I'd like to thank Paul for his very thorough remarks. At dinner last night, he was asking me why he was scheduled for 45 whole minutes, but he certainly met that. Very interesting remarks. We have 2 microphones set up at the side. If anyone has any questions they want to ask him now, please do so. After these few questions are over, we're going to take a break out into the atrium. There should be coffee and sodas and a few things to munch on, and of course you can continue to talk to Paul one-on-one then or at lunch. But if anyone has questions now, please go up to the microphone, state your name and what organization you're from, and we welcome all questions. So thank you again, Paul.
Thank you.
Matt Kazansky, I'm a faculty member. This just sounds like an administrative nightmare. I've been an administrator in a law school, and I thought that was tough. But how does a situation like Haiti, how do you arrive at who will be at the top of the pyramid, if you will, to coordinate the United States participation? I mean, the Defense Department reported to you, but that was within the United States, but now you've got the UN and other contributing countries. Is there a system to get someone at the very top of the pyramid that manages the overall effort?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, within the U.S. government, it's fairly clear. You know, we have people who are designated to be the coordinator. So I was a coordinator for USAID. There was a coordinator for the State Department, and we have meetings that are chaired by the National Security Council. On foreign affairs issues, the National Security Council calls the foreign affairs agencies together and kind of hammers out decisions. More difficult is when you have so many international actors, governmental and then non-governmental. The system, this is the UN cluster system that I said, and the United States government was instrumental in helping push and create for the UN cluster system. I don't think I know anyone, including the head of the UN cluster lead in Haiti, who thinks it works well. But no one has a better idea as to how to replace it. So our view is we want to support, promote, improve the UN cluster system. The special coordinator for Haiti, Edmund Millet, and Nigel Fisher, his deputy, who's really the day-to-day operational chair of it, are extraordinarily capable, experienced guys. They have a ridiculous challenge. So, I mean, we second staff to them. We provide funding to them in order to manage the coordination, but it is a full-time job of a lot of people just to keep track of what's going on, who's doing what, identify gaps, program and target resources. And we keep getting distracted by hurricanes, cholera, the election impasse. So it's been, the last year has been one tragedy on top of another tragedy. So I think as an international system, we're going to limp along rather, for the next couple of years, making incremental improvements to the UN cluster system. But there's no one who's proposed a better idea so far.
Hi, I'm Megan, and I'm actually an Emory undergrad, and I have a work-study job at CARE. So I was just wondering, concerning USAID's cooperation with NGOs and IGOs, if you had to pick one of the following most significant ways USAID contributed, whether it was grants, program design, program evaluation, implementation, monitoring evaluation, I mean, what would you say that USAID had its main significant role in the Haiti earthquake, if you can say it only had one role?
If I could say it only had one role?
Yeah, I mean, if you had to say there was one way USAID contributed the most.
Well, obviously, we provided grant funding to all of those organizations you mentioned. But I think over time, the donor contribution has been, we do a lot of program design, so people respond to what we ask them to do. So that's significant. But over time, I think the monitoring and evaluation, the measuring, has become the expertise of the donors, because that leads, people do what you tell them to do. If you tell them we want 5,000 people trained, they'll train 5,000 people. But training people is not going to necessarily get you the result that you want. So thinking through carefully in advance, what are the indicators, what are the metrics of success, how do we know we're there, how do we know we've achieved the end states when we get there, and then having a system to monitor it has become the kind of the biggest value added of USAID and other international donors.
I'd like to turn this issue of coordination of civil response around a little bit. I know here in Atlanta there were a number of NGOs of varying sizes that responded to the earthquake in Haiti. If a small NGO were to ask you for advice on how do we make sure that we're all pushing in the same direction and we're not getting in your way, what can we do to better coordinate? What would you say?
I'd say join the UN cluster system. Attend the meetings. The cluster system it's called cluster because it's divided up by sectors. So there's a cluster for protection. There's a subcluster for gender-based violence. There's a cluster for water sanitation issues, one for health. a lot of NGOs, this is kind of a challenge you have in the government. We're very, and it's true, I think, in academia too. Everyone is stovepiped because everyone develops their technical specialties, and we think you need the technical specialist in each area. But then you go out into the field, and people don't say, I just have a need for this one little piece of, the needs are multi-sectoral. So all the NGOs, a lot of them they think it's a waste of time to go to 5 different cluster meetings, but they're working multi-sectorally, and the coordination system is divided up with technical specialties. So I think you have to devote the time. It requires staff time to devote it, and you waste a lot of time. And I can't say that going to coordination meetings is the most pleasant thing to do. They're boring and people fall asleep, but if you don't do it, then you don't know what's going on, and you can't, again, identify the gaps.
I'm Flora Manship. I'm a member of the International Law Review. I was wondering what are the issues that USAID deals with regarding the Foreign Assistance Act when the receiving country's government scores high on the UN corruption index?
On the corruption index?
Or it's just a very corrupt government?
For humanitarian assistance, we don't worry about levels of corruption in a country. It's just we have broad authority to respond, and we don't have to pay attention to that. There is an issue if it's a sanctioned country, and I didn't mention that, but if a country has itself or has institutions that are subject to treasury sanctions because of financing of terrorist organizations, for instance, that's a real problem. So doing humanitarian assistance in Iran can be an enormous challenge, and we have done small things in Iran, but you have to make sure that we find organizations, specific organizations that are not subject to sanctions, and target our assistance to those organizations, or you have to get a waiver from the U.S. Treasury.
Good morning. My name is Jenny V. Dowdle, and I'm a student in the Masters in Development Practice program here at Emory. First, I want to say thank you so much for your talk. It was very helpful and very educational. I know it was kind of at the end, so you didn't get to talk about it much, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the need to strengthen the market system and maybe what USAID is doing to help Haiti strengthen the market system. Is it primarily in giving advice on how to do that, or are there certain partnerships with private business as well?
Okay, so there's obviously macro and micro levels of this. Actually, the most useful class I ever took in law school was an economics class at the graduate school. For my current job, that is. I took several economics courses. If you're interested in development, take economics and statistics. It'll help. Haiti has macro and micro challenges that are enormous. They've made, if you think another one of the tragedies of Haiti is they had 4% growth for a couple of years before the earthquake. They were for the first time in 20 years on a positive trajectory. In the 1980s, Haiti's economic growth and stability was greater than the Dominican Republic, and now it's just hard to envision that. Things have turned around. They obviously had political issues, deep political challenges in the 80s, but economically, just focusing on that. So there's fiscal policy that needs to be improved. The monetary policy has been significantly improved. I think monetary and fiscal policy, they've made some advances on, but there's still some significant issues there. And what we do is technical advice on those issues. The IMF plays an important role there. For monetary policy, we use it through an interagency agreement. We have economists in our mission, but we bring in the U.S. Treasury on those issues as well, because they're real experts on monetary policy. The microeconomic issues, if you read Michael Porter's work, if you're interested in development, it's absolutely fundamental to read Michael Porter's stuff on microeconomics, because for many years, development theorists really didn't pay attention to that. His work is kind of related to Hernandez de Soto's insights. So how do you, Porter focuses on, it's all about productivity. You know, if you have people who make shoes in Bangladesh and they live in hovels and make 30 cents a day, and people who make shoes in Italy and they drive in private jets. So the difference is, what are you selling your product for? Are you generating value added? Do you have improved productivity? Are you continually improving productivity? Now getting at that requires a whole bunch of things. In most of these developing countries, the system for creating and regulating businesses is overwhelming. If you go if you try to start a business in Atlanta and you go down to the government offices, I suspect in a couple of hours you're out of there with everything you need. If you try to do that, sorry? No? No? In New York, it's a couple of hours. If you go to Haiti, Peru, Colombia would probably be good on the continuum. Any country in Africa, it's months, and it's a lot of money, and no one does it. So kind of simplifying systems, and that comes from the work of Hernando de Soto, and the World Bank is leading a process called Doing Business. They do these Doing Business reports that are really the gospel on this issue. If you're in development, you got to read the annual Doing Business report. And you can make a lot of process lowering costs and days to start a business, and there's a lot of data that shows that business activity will immediately increase. People will become entrepreneurial all over the world if you remove kind of old-fashioned shackles. So you have to do that. And then you have to kind of, if you think about Porter's work, you have to create, connect people to value chains. I was the director of our office of our mission in Peru for 4 years. During my time, Peru entered into a free trade agreement with the United States. A lot of free trade agreements, you'll see an immediate boom in productivity and profits for the large businesses. What happens to the small businesses? The Peruvian small businesses would worry that, well, we can't compete with American products. And I would always tell them, you're not competing with American products. You're competing with Chinese products and Colombian products. All the other countries that are trying to send stuff to the US, those are the people you have to beat. And the way you beat, you can't be a small farmer farming trout in the Andes easily and export your stuff to the US. But like one of the projects we did in Peru is I thought of trout because there's an American who in the 19th century introduced trout into the Peruvian Andes, and it's become one of their staple crops. It's grown at over 10,000 feet with glacial runoff water. It's a very specialized product that has an extraordinary taste. There's a huge market for it, but the small Andean farmer can't get it out. So you have to connect them to a supplier in Lima who has connections to markets overseas. And a lot of it is about creating those value chains or market linkages so small producers can get into big markets. So Peruvian trout farmers are exporting now to Japan and Norway and the United States. And if you can make those linkages, you can triple people's income pretty quickly. Sorry for the long answer, but I get excited about that issue.
Thank you. I'm Jenna, and I'm with CARE International. And I was wondering if the U.S. has any role in preparedness measures, like pre-disaster interventions, or running simulations, or capacity assessments, simulation planning, anything like that.
We do. Preparedness is obviously huge. I didn't talk about it at all. We do ongoing work through our Office of Fire and Disaster Assistance with the Department of Civil Protection, which is a little bit of a success story in Haiti. Before Hurricane Tomas, they were leading coordination meetings. Often it's led by the UN, but the Department of Civil Protection led the coordination meetings to prepare for the hurricane. And they had 100 people out in the camps assessing damage afterwards. So we've done, for years we were doing work with them, but we've ramped it up tremendously after the earthquake. And we also ramped up a system to do it in the smaller cities. Gonaive up to the north is usually hit even harder than Port-au-Prince. So kind of strengthening civil protection systems at the local level is critical. So we're doing that on an ongoing basis. I thought there was another part of your question that I'm forgetting. Oh. I guess the big issue now is it's still, we're going to hit another hurricane season, rainy season in April, May, and we still have a lot of displaced people. So part of the prevention is strengthen the capacity of the government to respond. Part of it is we're going to support IOM, the International Organization for Migration, is working on building shelters. There were not hurricane shelters for the one that passed through last year, and there was no time to construct them, but there is a little bit of time now. So providing a system of shelters in Haiti long-term is critical for that country. They're going to be subject to these disasters all the time, and they're mostly going to be hurricanes and floods, so having shelters is key. Okay, well, thank you very much.